Hello, my name is Steve, and this video is going to be a short survey of what the Old and New Testament has to tell us about the topic of tithing, i.e., what is the relevance for tithing for the Christian church and the Christian individual today. So first up, let me set the stage here in two different ways. First of all, I believe that the message of the overarching message of the New Testament is calling the Christian to be generous. Generosity and giving in a voluntary sense is not in question in any way, shape or form as I raise this topic of tithing. And I'd like to also say that the topic of tithing is handled by different organizations, as in Christian churches, very differently. So whilst some teach tithing, they may not make it compulsory or even push people to do it, or even stipulate that there is some kind of connection between God blessing the Christian and the dependency on that of the Christian following some kind of ordinance of tithing that is still applicable to the New Testament Christian. So there's a broad range, and I would say that the negative criticism that may come about in this video is predominantly levied towards prosperity gospel preaching style organizations that frequently also have very large amount of costs to cover in their organization, and of course the temptation for this tithing idea to be the stepping stone to cover that massive cost is huge, and at the same time also to give the Christian this idea that God blesses those who tithe and he does not bless, or even dare I say use another word, to those who do not do it. So there's a broad range here. It's a secondary issue. I'm in no way stating that just because somebody chooses to do so that they are therefore not a Christian. Absolutely not. This is a secondary issue. Nonetheless, I think it is important to understand what the Bible actually has to tell us about it. So first of all, let me state historically, and this is relatively easy to look at as in review from archaeological and historical sources, that tithing is not something that the Old Testament invented. This was a very common concept in pagan societies in ancient Mesopotamia, Syria, Greece, Lydia, Phoenicia, and even Rome, and so and throughout all of the historic ages ever since. But importantly, it was not something that these pagan societies learned or adopted from Old Testament culture. Far from it. They did this before the Old Testament culture came to be. So is tithing an unchanging standard? Now, in many groups today, basically the message is it's 10% of your gross income, it should be before taxed, it should be observed by all Christians, free will offerings are to be given in addition. And as I said, many insist even that it's an unchanging internal principle, that it existed prior to the Mosaic law and therefore is also still applicable to the modern day church. And the question, of course, is that true? And of course, the danger here is that it can lead to all sorts of legalistic and even harmful abuses, which in many instances it does actually do. So we're going to raise a range of different questions as we look at this subject. So the questions I'm going to aim to answer is, number one, did everyone tithe during the Old Testament period? I'm going to look at who received the tithe in the Old Testament. Was tithing practiced by all before the Mosaic law? Did Jesus tithe? Is tithing endorsed by Paul in the other New Testament epistles? And of course then, therefore, finally, how should the Christian, the New Testament Christian, respond? And in this sense also the New Testament Christian church. So let's start And I want to reiterate, this is a very brief survey. I'm going to give a detailed book in the resource, as in the link to when I upload this to YouTube, and I would highly recommend the student of this topic to look at this book. It's freely available to be downloaded on the internet. It is a PhD thesis of a seminary student that I think is extremely well put together and goes into a lot more detail than I can in this short survey. So pre-Mosaic tithing, as in pre-Mosaic law. Now, the one instance, there are two major instances, but this is the first one in Genesis 14. We see in verses 18 to 20. In fact, we'll jump to the next slide so you can read, so we can quickly read these two verses. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abraham, by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Now, it is alleged by some that because the word God Most High is used here, that Melchizedek in this instance, in some sense, is some kind of priest king. And without going into a great deal of detail of depth, the Most High God here is actually a Canaanite designation for Baal. And this is referenced by many scholars. This is not the name that is given to the God of Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament, the God of I Am, the God of Moses. This is a very different title. And it is also important to note that in this very same instance, the king of Sodom, who was obviously a wicked king, appears to be being used as the representative, as in, you need to read the context of this. But the idea that Abraham somehow is giving a tenth of all of his property to some kind of pre-Mosaic priest in God's order, this is not the context of this passage. And it's interesting here, importantly, to note that this is a war tribute. And under Mosaic law, if you look at Numbers chapter 31, that under Mosaic law, we have 1/50th of 1/2 equals just 1% is given to the Levites as a war tribute. So, and this is a war tribute. So there is a very big discrepancy here if this was some kind of ongoing instituted situation, but far from it. I think it's much more obvious that this here is a pagan king, especially with the connection of Sodom, and Abraham is doing something that was commonly done by pagans at the time. And if you read the context, Abraham was actually very adverse towards taking anything of the spoil of the situation, because he did not want to be seen to be taking a gift from pagans. So far from what many want this passage to mean, that it is not what they say it is. And it's important also to know this is a narrative. This is not a prescriptive law type passage. And a narrative means just that. It is telling us something, but it is not prescribing something to us, like so many other passages. And we should not be falling into the trap of taking a narrative passage and turning it into a prescriptive law or ordinance style passage. So we keep on with this here. Basically is a little bit more of a detailed description, and I might just read this out because I think this is quite helpful. As documented in the first chapter, this is a snippet from this book, tithing did not originate in the Bible, and nobody claims that it did. So scholars do not. It is well-known pagan practice from Phoenicia, Egypt, Canaan, Mesopotamia, and lands around the Fertile Crescent. It was a mandatory, customary tax to a pagan god or ruler, which is more than likely the context here. The Roman Empire continued this tradition by requiring its defeated subject nations, like Israel, to return the spoil of the first tithe of the land to them. From a comparison of discussions of verse 21, Abraham's tithe to Melchizedek was in obedience to this old Arab war custom, and was not a command from Yahweh. Evidently, the Arab war custom specified that 10% of the spoils of war be given to the local priest king, while 90% belonged to the victor. So we can see here that there are several important issues. First of all, number one, even if you were to take this narrative as a prescriptive passage, which you shouldn't do, there is no commandment of God. There's here an observance of a pagan custom. Number two is Abraham is not giving of his personal property, but it is spoils of war, and it was a war with unbelievers. There's not a Mosaic holy land tithe. He returned 100% to the Canaanites. So he actually gave everything to the Canaanites back, what he took. Not a means of wealth through Arab law-keeping. It was not quoted to support tithing for Hebrews or Christians. So this passage is never quoted anywhere in the rest of especially the New Testament, which is what frequently tithe supporters tend to do. And it is not a condition of receiving God's blessing promised through faith. And it is important here that it is also not to Abraham's Lord, Yahweh. This is a clear distinction because the title is El Elyon. So then we have the second major one that is used in this favor, and this is Jacob's bargain with God. And we see here in Genesis 28 that Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I will go, and will give me bread and clothing, etc., so that I could return to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a full tenth. And again, this is a narrative passage. This is not a prescriptive passage. And we will see importantly, although this time it is not a war spoil, like with Abraham, but like Abraham, Jacob is not responding to a command that God gave him. In fact, here it seems to be more like a rash vow that depends on God blessing him first. So we're not seeing that God is setting the conditions, but rather Jacob is setting the conditions for God. He's telling God, well, if you do this, then I will do this. God never asked Jacob to do such a thing. God does greatly bless Jacob, but there is later no mention of the tithe in the remaining passages about Jacob. And of course the all-important question is, to whom did Jacob actually give the tithe, if he actually did? Because there was no priesthood, there was no temple, and there was no God-given king. There were only pagan rulers available, and it would have clearly been idolatry for Jacob to give pagan rulers a tithe that he had promised to God. So that it raises all sorts of questions to me that I think it definitely cannot be used in favor of saying that this is some kind of a prescription for modern day Christians. If anything, it is more to be seen as simply a promise that Jacob made to God in the hope that God would bless him. Because Jacob clearly had some serious character flaws, as the whole story about him demonstrates. So then we come to the all-important Mosaic ordinances, and these are deliberated in great detail in Numbers chapter 18. And I'm just going to summarize this chapter into some major points here. I noticed actually that I've numbered them wrong. Forgive me. I just noticed that. Never mind the numbers. Only national Israel was ever commanded to tithe. So we don't see that anybody else is given this command. And in fact, only the Aaronic priests are the ones who draw near to God. This is also really important to understand. So not all of the Levites who received tithes were those who drew near. Only a very small subsection of them. And it is those actually who are the ones who operate as in the temple duty in Jerusalem. So Levites who received the first tithe, and there is a distinction here in terms of the first and the second tithe, and the second tithe is a tithe of a tithe, and this will become more obvious in a moment. But if I can maybe briefly explain, the Levites was the tribe as the children of Israel entered the promised land. They were not given an allotment of land. They were the only tribe who were to depend completely for their existence on God. All the other tribes received land, And the firstborn son of every household was to be given the land from his father. So if a father had 5 sons, only the firstborn was to be given that piece of land. And if the other sons worked as all sorts of other tradesmen, they actually did not tithe. It was the landowner that tithed. The landowner tithed to the Levites, the local Levites in all the different towns and areas in Judea or in the whole of the Israelite kingdom at that stage. And those Levites then tithed of that tithe, which was the tithe of the tithe, to Jerusalem. And this is really important as we come later to look at Malachi chapter 3. When it's talking about tithing there, it is actually talking about the tithe of a tithe, as in effectively 1% of only the landowners. So it's very, very different to the way that people have interpreted or somehow taken this whole rollover to think that all Christians are suddenly called to do this. So it's important to understand the Levites received the first tithe, and they were merely servants, if you like, government officials. Neither priests nor Levites could own property, so none of them could. And tithes effectively for them replaced property inheritance rights. In other words, it was their God-given right to receive this money because they were not allowed to own property. So the Aaronic priests, who were the ones who were later would be operating in the temple, because they were only the ones who were allowed to draw near in the tabernacle and later in the temple, they received tithes from the Levites, not from all the other people. Effectively, this was a tithe of a tithe, and effectively it was 1% of only a small percentage of the people of Israel. And it's also important to understand that tithes were never money. Tithes were only consisted of food because they were always eaten. So only 1% was brought into the temple in the storehouse, where it was later used for food consumption. That's important to understand when we come to Malachi 3. So the standard tithe given to the Levites was eaten where they lived. So imagine if you were in a small town somewhere in the countryside, and you gave, as the landowner, you gave 1/10 of your crop to the Levite that was living in your area. They were allowed to eat that where they lived, and they collected 10% of that. That then went to Jerusalem into the storehouse later, when Jerusalem was the capital and the temple was built. So it's very, very different to the way that people in a modern sense look at this whole thing. And then there are some really important other facts about the Old Testament tithe. So it's important to know that it must only come from the land of Canaan. We can see that in Leviticus 27. And it was to stop if Israel were expelled from his land, which Israel was. So during that period, the Israelites did not collect tithes. It was only to be collected from that particular piece of land. So even in that sense, when you think of the modern day churches collecting tithe, we do not live in the land of Israel, and we're not benefiting from that land. Therefore, even in a legal Old Testament sense, we're not called to pay tithes. So even if you were a modern day Jew, you were not commanded to do that. And the tithes, so as in the second tithe, as in the tithe of the tithe, the one that was brought to Jerusalem, could only be eaten in Jerusalem. It could be exchanged for money and used to buy wine, but it could not be given in money. So it could be exchanged for money. But tithes were not money, they were always food. And importantly also, no tithe from the farmland every 7th year and every 50th year, so that the Holy Land could rest. These are interesting and important farming principles. But again, if those people who somehow think that this is an eternal principle, those principles are all being left, they fall by the wayside in that sense. And they are important to understand because they put a very, very different picture together than what is presented in the modern church. Another important factor that's really crucial, because tithing can be can be abusive. And the poor in the Old Testament did not tithe. And it is interesting to note that the poor in the Old Testament were counted among the Levites when it concerned tithing. So when people brought their tithe to the Levites were not the only ones who could live off this tithe, but also the poor and also the stranger. And we have, in this sense, also the gleaning laws that you might remember that are documented also in the New Testament. And this is also important as we come to look at whether Jesus tithed. So important, the context in Malachi, which is this highly abused chapter Malachi chapter 3, is about priests oppressing the poor and stranger by not allowing them to have what was rightfully theirs, in that the poor were to be looked after by the tithe in the same manner as Levites were. And basically in this chapter in Malachi, the prophet is warning the priests, as in those who receive the second tithe, the tithe of the tithe, the 1%, they were not sharing that with the poor. So that's in that context is what Malachi 3 is about, talking about robbing God. It is by far not about talking about the normal person, the normal Jew who lived in the land, who may have been working as a goldsmith or as a carpenter. They did not tithe anyway, so that they, by definition, could not be robbing God of a tithe that they were never asked to give. So, really important to underpin and point out that the poor did not give tithes, they received them. And in this sense, it's important to understand that therefore Jesus' parents did not tithe. And of course that means also Jesus didn't. They were poor carpenters. We see this in Luke chapter 2 verse 24, that they offered the offering that was set for a poor person, which is precisely the if you like, the definition that is given in the Old Testament law as to what should happen when somebody wants to bring an offering and cannot afford the expense of the offering. They can bring offerings that are designated for a poor person, and as Jesus' parents did precisely that. This is evidence that Jesus' parents were both poor and were not required to tithe. And of course, evidently also that they did not own land. So, and then we see in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus and his disciples are gleaning, and gleaning was legally set out in the Old Testament as an ordinance in order to look after the poor. And of course, Jesus did not disobey the Old Testament law, so clearly he would never have allowed his disciples to glean had they been wealthy. None of Jesus' disciples were farmers, and in this sense, they were not required to tithe. So, to round up this all-important passage in Malachi, we're talking about ministers robbing God here. So if you want to relegate this to the New Testament, this would be, the only possible way to say this would be the assistant pastor not paying enough money to support the pastor, which of course is silly, because that's not the context. But this is precisely what is going on in Malachi chapter 2. The priests had broken their covenant and had not allowed the poor and the stranger to partake in the offerings and the benefit of the tithes being brought to them, as in the tithe of the tithe. So importantly here, priests were the villains. And in fact, it was the high priests, not the Levite servanthood style priests, as in those who were not allowed to minister. It was the ones who had been given the absolute privilege of ministering in the temple. Those were the ones who were the villains here. So, important to understand, therefore, that concerning food tithes, the storehouse in Jerusalem was only to be the storage place for constantly replaced food, used to feed the priests and Levites who rotated in and out of the temple every week for 1 week ministry. And we see this in Nehemiah. This is actually the context of Malachi chapter 2 and 3. In chapter 10 in Nehemiah, we see in these various verses where the storehouse is and what is actually brought to the storehouse, and it just underpins the context of Numbers 18 that only 1% was brought to the temple storehouse. The rest, the whole tithe, the 10% that was given by the landowners, that remained in the Levitical cities. So context is hugely important in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So when we compare, or we attempt to compare the storehouse idea with the New Testament church, we see that the storehouse in Jerusalem received only 1%, and it was food. The storehouse, property of religious state. The New Testament church is not the property of a religious state. We do not have the church ruling the state. We have clear separation between church and state in the New Testament era. The Old Testament storehouse received food, never money. The New Testament tithing, clearly, as in if we want to roll a storehouse idea into the New Testament, that's always money. The Old Testament provided for the poor. The New Testament tithes, in principle, do not. I'm not suggesting that the New Testament churches do not provide for the poor. They, of course, frequently do. But the predominant people, the voices behind this idea that Christians should pay a tithe, they are not doing it in order to service the poor. More often than not, they are doing it in order to service the machinations and big business style operations of big churches. The Old Testament tithes were the sustenance for priests, but in the New Testament, all believers are priests. So essentially, the tithes should be given, if that was the case, to all the believers. The Old Testament priests could not own land. The New Testament church staff can. And no one in their wildest dream would seem to think that a pastor cannot own the house he lives in. That seems to be ludicrous. Jews never collected money on the Sabbath. That's really important also. All throughout, there's no example ever of the Jews collecting money on the Sabbath, yet that's what we do in the church. And I'm not suggesting that churches should not collect money. I'm just making a clear distinction between the New Testament church is not the Old Testament storehouse. So then we have the few mentions of tithe in the New Testament, and we see this in two of the Gospels, in Luke 11 and Matthew 23. And importantly, that because this is not an endorsement of Jesus giving a prescriptive command to the New Testament church to tithe. Far from it. Matthew chapter 23 and Luke 11, but probably more so even in Matthew 23, the entire chapter is about Jesus pronouncing woes on the Pharisees, the priesthood of the day. Not too unlike the chapters in Malachi chapter 2 verse 3. And far from it being a prescription of the New Testament church in terms of whether we should or shouldn't tithe, this is all about Jesus calling judgment onto the Pharisaical leadership of his day. And incidentally, this leads straight into Matthew 24, which I think very clearly points towards the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So this has the context here has nothing to do with the New Testament church being given an ordinance to tithe. So to summarize, and I think this is hugely important because this is the frequent message that the tithe pushers give, is that there's somehow some kind of curse because of this, the mention of this in Malachi 3, that there's some kind of a curse upon those who do not tithe, and the only way you can remove this curse is by tithing, which is ludicrous when you think of the finished work of Christ that is so beautifully rounded up for us here in this amazing statement by Paul in the letter to the Galatians, which is incidentally a letter dealing with Judaizing heresy, which has to do with legalism, and I'm just going to read it. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone that hangs on a tree. So anyone who would pronounce any kind of curse on a Christian has clearly not understood the gospel, has clearly not grasped the fundamental, foundational gospel message, the good news of Jesus. And I'd like to finish and leave you with that thought.